Hi everyone, welcome to this session on macro essential techniques. Today we'll look at the equipment and the techniques used to shoot macro underwater. What is macro exactly? Macro is a little bit of a fuzzy notion where typically people would consider that if you're shooting at a 1-to-1 ratio, this is really macro. Anything beyond that, bigger than real life, would be considered super macro, and anything else is, well, it's not quite macro. In reality, most people shoot, somewhere around 1-to-1 or 1-to-2 and still call it macro, and that's the definition we'll use for today. Now, why do a session on macro? Macro is easy, right? At least that's what I hear very often. Well, I mean, sure, generally macro subjects are smaller, a bit more sluggish, pun intended. And so it's a bit easy to take your time and frame the subject correctly, get the right composition, try different lighting techniques, different angles. In reality, though, to get a really nice looking, beautiful macro picture takes actually quite a lot of effort, and sometimes more than it would take to get the nice picture of seascape and wide angle images or big pelagic images. So let's dive into it and see what we can do. So let's talk about lens choices. You will need a lens that can give you at least a 1-to-1 reproduction ratio, obviously. Some shooters like long lenses, like 100, 105, or even much longer, like 150 mm. That's fine. If it works for you, that's good enough. Personally, I prefer shorter lenses that get me closer to the subject, and they're also lighter, easier to control. My lens of choice on Nikon would be a 60 mm macro. On Canon, probably a 50 mm would be an ideal choice as well. What about camera settings, you may ask? Typically, like most pro shooters, I shoot in full manual mode. So that's what you see on the top left of the screen. As a starting point for shutter speed and aperture, I would normally start at 1/250 for the shutter speed and f/16 for the aperture. We'll play with that later, but that's a pretty good starting point for macro shooting. I've set my flash to rear sync, which you see just under the M on the top left. And then I like to use 3D tracking, which you see in the sort of bottom left of the screen here. We'll go through that in a minute. And then I've set the ISO to 200 and white balance to auto. I think this sums it up pretty well. And we'll be going through what we can change and when we should change these settings as we go along. One of the things we'll have to worry about when shooting macro is depth of field. This is because being very close to the subject will have as an effect to reduce the depth of field to a very small area. One way to manage this and to increase our chances of having the area we want in focus is to use a small aperture. In this case, we've started with f/16 as mentioned before, and this will generally give us anywhere between a few millimeters to a few centimeters in focus. On the other hand, sometimes we may not want to have a full subject and parts of the background in focus, and this is because we may want to focus on a specific aspect like the eyes of the subject. In that case, we may want to do the other way and reduce the aperture number, so make an aperture larger than f/16, and for instance we could use f/8, f/5.6, or even f/2.8, and that will allow to blur the background and most of the subject, leaving just one small area in focus. Speaking about focus, one of the difficulties when shooting macro is to make sure that the area, the very specific area that you want to be in focus, actually is in focus. And this is one of the reasons why I really like to use this 3D focus tracking that I was mentioning before. This has different names in different brands of cameras, but essentially it's the function that allows you to hold the focus by half pressing the shutter and the camera will then analyze the picture, understand the context of the point that you are focusing on, and based on that, it will keep the focus point in focus, essentially, wherever it may be in the frame. And so this allows you to basically focus on the eyes, for instance, and then if the subject is moving in the frame, or if you want to change the composition slightly, change the angle, maybe shoot from below, which we'll talk about in a minute, this will actually make sure that everything that you want to be in focus remains in focus. Camera, you aim at the point that you want to be in focus, you half press the shutter, and then you can recompose the image as you wish and press the shutter only when you're ready. And this should, in theory, give you the composition that you want with the point that you want in focus.
So how might this look inside the viewfinder? Well, basically, you can see my little fish here. I will focus on the eye. That's what the little red dot does. And I keep the finger half pressed on the shutter, and as I'm moving around to maybe adjust the composition, or maybe it's the subject itself that's actually moving around the frame, I can always keep the eye in focus. I can move forward, I can move back, I can move left, right, and it still will keep the eye in focus. So that's how this technique works when you look at it through the viewfinder.
A lot of macro subjects are crawling or swimming very close to the bottom. And this means that you'll have to be very careful with the background, and in particular, you'll have to try to avoid background clutter, because the negative space, the space that's around the subject, is almost as important as the subject itself and how you light it. And there are different ways of dealing with this. The best way is to find subjects that are slightly off the bottom. This means is that your camera will be aimed upwards, and this will allow you to have a clear, unobstructed background, basically the water surrounding the subject. This clear background will basically allow you to frame your subject in a very clear manner, detaching it from the background and giving it the best chances of standing out. Many macro images have a black background, and sometimes people ask me if this is because they're shot at night, and obviously that's not the case. It's because they're shot with a small aperture and a very fast shutter speed, which basically blackens the background water. But at times you may want to have a lighter colored background, and to do this, basically all of the settings remain the same, whether it's the ISO, the flash power setting, everything else remains the same. All you have to do is just change the shutter speed to a rather slow one. And it can be very, very slow. Really, it could be as low as 1/30th, 1/15th of a second, sometimes even lower than that. And this will actually give you a blue background with exactly the same foreground appearance as you would have if you had a much smaller shutter. And this will give you exactly the same image, but with a blue background instead of a black one. One of the most important things we have to concern ourselves when we're doing underwater photography is lighting, light placement, since this is what we're doing. We're recording light. And this is all the more so with macro, since when you're shooting macro, most of the time, the only light source that you'll have is the artificial lights that you're bringing with you, be they fixed lights like a torchlight or strobes. And therefore, let's see how we're going to place them to avoid one of the major problems that we have when we're shooting underwater, which is backscatter. So when you're shooting wide angle, what you would do normally is put the two flash or single flash, whatever light source you have, as far away to the sides, and angle them in such a way that the light beam will just hit the subject itself and not light up the dirt and the particles and whatever you have in the water in front of you. And obviously for macro, this is going to be slightly different because our subject is going to be very close to the front of the camera. So we have to push the light sources very close to the front of the camera as well. But at the same time, we still have to be careful with the angle at which it's going to hit the subject, because if we are lighting the water in front of the subject, we are likely to get backscatter. And this is all the more true with macro than because when we are shooting macro, it very often happens to be in locations where visibility is not very good and the water is quite loaded with particles. And so light placement is as important for macro shooting as it is for wide angle or any kind of underwater shooting. So if we have one flash, we'll just put it very close, or any kind of light source, we'll put it very close to the front on one side, but this could actually generate shadows, quite stark shadows actually. So we can put another light source on the other side if we have one. And it doesn't need to be at the same power setting. If it is, well, it will just create an image that could be quite flat. So generally you can play with the power settings. The main angle, the one you're looking at the subject from, you would put that at the higher power setting, and the other side of the subject where you just want to soften the shadow or eliminate the shadow, you can put the light source at the lower power setting. And looking at it from the top, this is how it would look, or from the side really, it would look like this. If you have a single light source, one position that you could adopt is to put the light source right on top of the lens, right on top of the camera, aimed downwards at the subject. And this can actually create reasonable images with just one light source. Now, sometimes you may want to cut down on the clutter around the subject and make it really the focus of attention, the center of the picture. And to do this, one simple trick that you can use is to use a snoot. Now, a snoot essentially is a light funnel. It's something that directs the light to a very small area. And again, this can just help you to focus the attention of the public, whoever's looking at your photo, onto the subject itself rather than on its surroundings, when maybe it's not that interesting what's around it. And you could use, you can make your own snoot really. You can use a water bottle like what you see on the screen now. A wide funnel could work as well. Strap it onto your light source and you're good to go. But as you can see, it will look a little bit odd, and it may cut down quite a lot of the light. On the other hand, there are a number of commercial snoots that are available and that you can pick for your particular light source. And these are much more targeted, much better options if you can afford it. So let's look at some of the pictures that we have here. I've put a series of images where we're looking at first how it looks like when you're shooting with a normal light source, which just spreads the light all the way around. And then I've made another image, this time with a snoot, which shows that pretty much everything around the subject, everything in the background is darkened or even blackened to the point that all you see, all you focus your attention on is the subject itself. And this is exactly what the snoot is for. Another possible approach to get the focus of attention onto your subject is to use a completely different angle for lighting it up. And one way to do this is to backlight the subject. Now, obviously, you can't do that with every single subject. You could try with a completely opaque subject, but that would probably give you just a dark shadow at the center and just a wash of light around it. Could be interesting, but it may not be what you want. On the other hand, with subjects that are either transparent or slightly translucent, you can achieve some very interesting images this way. And I've put together a series of images. Again, the first one would be taken with a normal flash position, a normal strobe position, or a normal fixed light position, meaning from the same side as the camera. And another way is the second set of images, sorry, is actually from the back of the subject, where the light is allowed to pass through it, and we're basically capturing a completely different image. And as you can see in the images, this gives very, very interesting, very artistic images, much more interesting, in my opinion anyway, than the original image with a normal, traditional way of lighting the subject. This typically can be done with a flash that you have detached from the arm, but you could be limited very quickly by the length of your sync cord and or the optic cable that you're using to trigger your flash. On the other hand, you would generally benefit from having a focus light anyway to assist your camera in focusing, because the scene that it's looking at underwater in potentially murky water could be quite dark, and therefore having a focus light is always a good idea. Now, you can easily detach that particular focus light and use your arm or ask your dive buddy to hold it at certain angles behind the subject, and always being very careful not to show the actual light, the light source in the photo. And this is a very easy way to capture this sort of images. Since we're talking about shooting small things, how about if you want to shoot something really, really small and you want it to look reasonably large in the frame? There exist a number of ways that you can do this. Each of them has pros and cons. It depends largely on one, the camera that you have, and two, on the amount of money you want to spend on this. One of the easiest and cheapest ways of doing this, if you are shooting with a DSLR, is to use an extension tube. This is basically nothing more than a hollow tube, you know, I can put a finger through, that basically pushes the lens further. It sits between your camera and your lens, and it's working on the same principle of what happens when you have a room projector and you move it out to get a bigger picture on the screen. The image gets a bit dimmer because the same amount of light has to spread over a bigger area, but you do get a bigger image. This is really, really cheap, really easy to use, but you do get a lot of light fall off. If you want to avoid that, you can actually use a teleconverter. A teleconverter is a lens. I would not put my finger through. I don't want finger marks on it. But this is essentially like a magnifying glass. And again, it sits between your lens and your camera, and it magnifies the image. It's a good solution. It can enhance it as much as 1.4 times, 1.7 times, 2 times. So you can shoot pretty small subjects, and you can get up to 2:1 reproduction ratio. But at the same time, it does have limitations in the sense that your focus speed will be greatly reduced, and also you will be highly limited during your dive as to the size of the subject that you can shoot. Once you're with an extension tube or with a teleconverter, you're stuck with it for the entire dive. Another system that you can use to give you the flexibility of having it on or off is a diopter. A diopter is like reading glasses for the lens. So you can get pretty close and it will magnify the image and make it bigger on the sensor. They exist in versions that can be attached directly to the lens, but that would not make much sense because, again, you're stuck with it for the dive. Or they come in versions that basically you can attach outside your housing, and as you can see, it magnifies the image. But on the other hand, it will not allow you to focus more than a certain distance, and this is the major disadvantage of diopters. You have only a certain distance that you can work with. For extremely small subjects, just a couple of millimeters long, like those on the screen, you probably need to go with a combination of probably diopter and teleconverter. And this is generally what I use when I know I'm going to be shooting extremely small subjects. And with this kind of arrangement, you can inch your way up towards 4:1 ratio and possibly even 10:1 ratio. One word of warning though is when you're doing this, you have the disadvantages of both the adapter and the teleconverter to deal with, and this will be extremely slow and difficult focus. So manual focus might be a better option for this kind of arrangement, and also extremely small depth of field. So you have to be very careful which part of the image you're focusing on. Now, in the difficult times that we're all facing right now, I'm sure some of you are already starting to plan your next dive trip for after this confinement is over. And I just have a thought for the various dive operators and dive resorts that are suffering a lot at the moment. And I just thought I'd give a quick roundup of those favorite destinations of mine to shoot macro. The first one would probably be Anilao in the Philippines, and my resort of choice is Ayana Resort, which is really nicely set up, really thought for the divers, and with a very good choice of macro dive sites, as well as some wide angle dive sites for if you're not so focused on this. The second dive resort I would like to mention is Yos Dive in Lembe. Lembe doesn't need an introduction. It's one of the best dive locations, if not the best dive locations in the world for macro, and this is where the word muck diving originates from, apparently. In the last issue of Ocean Geographic, I actually wrote a story on diving in Lembe over the past 20 years. And Yos Dive Lembe is a very casual resort. The dive guides are absolutely amazing. You can make a list of critters that you wish to see during your stay, and more likely than not, they will make it happen. The last possibly surprising location would be Raja Ampat. Raja Ampat is well known for its beautiful reefs and magnificent seascapes, but it does offer some incredible macro. And my operator of choice is Gaia Love. It's an amazing boat. Superb layout, superb interiors, and really well set up for both diving and for photography in particular. So once again, in those difficult times, if you're planning trips, please to give a thoughts to these guys. I hope you've really enjoyed this quick introduction or quick roundup of macro techniques. And if you want to find out more, do register as an Ocean Geographic member and read the magazine. There's plenty to go there. And you can also go to my website where hopefully you can be inspired by some of the images and get one or two of my books to help you with your underwater photography.
All right.
And we're back.
And we're back. Well, thanks for that. I'm just going in to try to see if we've got any questions that need to be answered right off the bat. Give me a second.
Sure.
I know some people were having issues with it saying that it needed a password, but I'm not sure if it did. Well, we are still live and we will still see how it goes. Okay, if anyone can see us still, which I think you can on Facebook, if you have questions for Matthew, you can actually type them in on our Facebook. The comments are just running as we go along. So if you have questions, please ask them that way. Type them in and we will receive them. Michael, do you have any specific topics that you want to continue talking about? Oh, wait, we have something down here.
You have, yeah, I'll come in a minute. Go ahead first.
Maybe I'll speak for Michael for a change. And just to...
What?
Okay. It's just to let everyone know about...
Now, but anyway, go ahead.
You know, it's about the magazine and the back issues being made available. You know, I don't know if you want.
Oh yes, and we need to mention the book too.
Yeah. Yes, and also
Yeah,
in your
yeah.
new book.
Yes.
We'll put on a special for the book in about an hour's time, especially the you can see the book, the Essential Masterclass with Mathieu as the author, and you go on special today with postage paid direct to your house, and also a few special on the previous advanced macro photography. We go on special this afternoon as well, and also the guide to coral reef invertebrates and fishes. So we put up this special later on today.
Very good. Well, I'd just like to say I really enjoyed your pen cap fish. I think that might have been my favorite part of it.
that is a new.
I know it's an exotic variety.
Exactly.
I've made two.
Well, you have to have a red and a blue. I mean, of course.
I couldn't find an orange one.
You need an orange one. So, yes,
You do need an orange one. It's the universal Ocean Geographic
it's
color.
great for practicing macro, though. I mean, I tell you what, if you're in your pool or in your bathtub or wherever, it's a great tool to practice.
I like it. That's fun. That was good. Yeah. Might have to try that out. I don't know. We're going to have a whole collection during quarantine of pen cap fish photos. It's going to be very exciting.
All right.
So I'll check one more time, but I don't think we have any questions that popped up because you did such a good job explaining it. Everyone is a macro expert now.
There you go.
So,
and
there you go.
The Ocean Geographic Pictures of the competitions, and you've got, I think, 6 more days to submit before the deadline on the 15th of April. So we'll put up more information today as well.
Sounds good. All right. Well, I think that pretty much concludes our first webinar. The second one is going to be at the same time. Yay! The second one is going to be at the same time tomorrow. So in approximately 24 hours, you're going to be stuck listening to me talking about the ethics of underwater photography. So you might want to avoid it entirely. Just kidding. Please show up. And that's going to be at 9 p.m. New York time on the 9th. So that's Eastern Standard Time on the 9th. And then that's Singapore time, 9 a.m. on the
10th of April. Yeah. 10th of April. Yes.
9th in Illinois or in the United States, and 10th in Singapore and Australia. All right.
See you tomorrow.
I think that does it. See you all tomorrow.
Thank you, Mathieu.
Thanks, Mathieu.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.